Good afternoon, and thank you for joining. My name is Joy Allen. I'm the Customer Success Manager for NetApp out of the Southfield, Michigan office. We have with us today Charles Fox, who will be presenting on OCI Application Programming Interface. And with that, I think it's probably about time to just pass it over to you, Charles. You can give a little bit about your background if you want, and go ahead and get started.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Charles Fox. I'm one of the customer success leads. Mostly I'm focused on U.S. public sector. My background, I spent 21 years at Microsoft as a SE. A couple of years prior, after that, I was at a cloud computing company where we ran, three of us ran 300,000 databases in multiple clouds. It's an interesting job. I have programming background. I started out in the industry as a programmer. Unfortunately, Fortran and PL1 aren't really hot skills these days. So I've had to try and update myself on these more web-based things. Today's topic is Introduction to OCI Application Interface and Database Access. I thought about the title I used here and thought, you know, I actually should have said points of integration with OCI, because we're going to talk about application programming interfaces as well as other means of getting data in and out of OCI, be that direct database access or through built-in components like email, SMTP, SNMP, etc. So we're going to go through all the ways that you can take OCI and hook it up to other systems to give you a sum part that's, or a whole that's greater than the sum part, so to speak. Come on, go forward. Yep, there we go. So what we're going to look at is the what I'll call the ecosystem and the various APIs. We're going to spend some time on the REST API, as this is probably where you're going to do your most intense amount of work. If you're going to do something custom, it'll probably be here. We'll take a look at how you can use that and how you can learn about it using OCI itself. Then we'll talk about database access through ODBC and JDBC, and access from the standpoint of another application, which is, in this particular case, ServiceNow. We'll talk about SNMP. There's been some changes in there. We've been able to do SNMP and OCI for quite some time, but there's some new features in there that are a really interesting integration point, as well as using things like the Syslog to hook OCI into other systems. So we offer various points of integration, certainly. What you're trying to do will determine what you're probably going to use. If, you know, again, as I mentioned, if it's very custom work, you'll probably be using the REST API. If it's a simple message passing between your ticketing system and OCI for somebody to look at something, that's probably email. There's already a number of tools that use these interfaces out of the box that you can integrate with, but custom connection development, it's an option. And this is a very valuable thing to have a set of consistent APIs across the platform. So what are some examples of these? Notice on top the Insight server, SNMP. We can pull from SNMP sources. We can pull from JSON sources, which is the REST API, and we can push email and JSON payloads from the REST API as well. Now, there's also the second half of the OCI world, which is the data warehouse. The data warehouse pulls data from the OnCommand Insight server and builds up a historical reference, which is typically looked at with Cognos, but we can also integrate other data sources like importing Excel databases using JDBC and ODBC to pull in data from other SQL sources and export these things in various different formats as reports, Excel, CSV files, etc. So again, a lot of different ways to do it, but do note that there is a little bit of a difference between what the data warehouse typically does and what the OnCommand Insight server does. Okay, so let's get into how we do this. it's an introduction to REST. REST is, as you can see, is short for Representative State Transfer. It's a style of writing APIs that use essentially formatted URLs to encode commands and the targets of those commands and that sort of thing. So HTTP verbs, URLs, etc. It's pretty straightforward. It's very common. It's used on a lot of systems these days. It's designed to be very simple to use. It's easy to interface with because web services are typically available on all operating systems these days as a means of integration. It's language agnostic, meaning that if you can generate this string and send and receive the results, odds are you can process it with whatever language you like. It is stateless, so it doesn't require a continuous connection, which is always good in the web world. And the design of it's very extensible. It's just currently the way of sort of programming. So when you use a REST API, the first thing you do is you make a request of your target system. So what's this look like in the OCI world? Now, again, these are based on HTTP, so they're going to look like a standard URL, much like you type in to go to any other website. But in this case, we're identifying resources and actions and targets of those actions. So here is a sample REST request for looking at all the storage assets in an OCI database. It is a secure protocol. It doesn't have to be. It can run over HTTP as well. We recommend, of course, that you use a secure link. It's pretty much mandatory, although not technically required. But it's good to know that your data is secured bidirectionally if you use HTTPS. The target is our OnCommand Insight server's host name. That makes a lot of sense, right? The endpoint is a REST endpoint, and it also gives the version number. You can have multiple versions of APIs available on systems, so it's important that we define which one we're using so that it gets interpreted correctly. And in OCI's case, when we build this out, the next component is the resource type that we're asking about. And the next example shows an identifier tagged on the end. The OCS components, if we were to use the top URL, that would give us all the storage. It would enumerate everything that was there. If we wanted a single instance of storage, we'd have to know what its unique identifier was. And that's available by polling the interface and saying, hey, what storage do I want? Going through that, finding out which one you're interested in by what's in the payload, pulling out its identifier, and then querying on that specific identifier and give you very much more concise information. And that's the resource object ID. So that's kind of what it looks like to build one of these. We can also cascade down that as far as the OCI database will let us. In other words, we might have a server and it has storage and it has disks, and those disks then have volumes and that kind of thing. So we can keep extending this URL according to the definition of the API and get very granular about what it is we're interacting with on the system. So that's referred to as a nested resource. And these don't have to be unique objects. You can have arrays of objects. If you go in and ask the system for something that enumerates in multiple places, again, like multiple disks attached to a single controller or something of that nature, you will get a list back, and you can then parse that list and operate on it. Okay. So once you've figured out what you want your request to be and what you want your targets to be, and you've assembled your URL, you send that off to the target system, you will receive a response back. The response is in JSON, or JavaScript object notation. This is also very similar to what a lot of people refer to as XML. It is essentially a structured flat text data file that has object identifiers and their properties associated with them. So if we were to make a request like as such we built in the former slide, we get a response. And as you can see, if it's pretty small on the screen, at least it's human readable, unlike binary APIs where you'd get a response back and basically get a bunch of hex numbers or something of that nature that you wouldn't be able to read. With JSON, at least you can look and see, you can generally get a general gist of what's going on. We have the identifier of what the object is. In the top line, it's the ID, and you can see the reference number that we put in the URL original request. But it's also followed by all the other data that's associated with that particular object. So again, very readable, easy to parse with any number of tools, and very easy for most systems to ingest.
Thank you.
Yes. Did I hear a question? Yeah. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Don't get ahead of myself here. Let's take a look at. All right. I'm going to log into my OCI server here. Should be familiar to all of you. And we're going to take a look at where this API is documented. There's a lot to it, but interestingly enough, the documentation for it is embedded in the system itself under help, REST API documentation. Let that load up. And as you can see, there is a number of paths that you can take with requests that reference their task and what they're pointing at, like administrative tasks or assets that, for instance, they're in the database. So let's pick an obvious one. To the right side, there's also a number of options that you can perform on these, but let's pick something like hosts. That's pretty straightforward. You can see that there are a number of methods with this, if you will. Assets hosts, we have a number of options to get data from the system. We can also put data back. Most the APIs are aimed at pulling information from the server, but there are a few that allow us to do things like, for instance, annotations is a good one. Annotations aren't automatically generated in an OCI and typically have to be added manually, but if one had some outside system that had business-related information, you could use the API to attach those annotations to particular objects, for instance. But let's take a look at retrieve all hosts. Now, as you can see, when I click on that, it expands out the reference, if you will, and we can see what the response that what the model looks like to send to the system, and we can see what resources it's going to return when we do that. Now, if you look carefully, and again, this may be hard to see, there is a little yellow triangle with an exclamation point in it next to some of the attributes. And you'll see this throughout the documentation. This indicates that that API is not necessarily finalized. So be careful when you use those, that they may change in the future. There are authentication requirements. A question came in as to is there authentication required? And yes, it is. I'm authenticated into this session because I logged in through the browser, and the browser has the credentials cached. If you were using this API in some kind of script or something, you would have to be able to provide credentials back to establish that you have a valid session key to communicate with the server. So let's take a look here. One of the nice things is we can see the parameters. We could fill in the parameters if we wanted to limit this inquiry. And we see the status codes that come back. If you're at all familiar with working with HTTP, these are normal. These are just like the same ones you'd get from a regular website. And this is the security requirements that are allowed. This one is allowed by anybody. And so we have the option of being to hit try it out, which is nice that right within the documentation itself, we can hit the live database and kind of see what we're going to get. This is the URL that it generated. Okay? And this is the response that we got back. So the name of the first server on the list, it happens to have an ID of 128. It's a New York exchange, etc. And we could see all the bits and pieces in there. It came back. Now, this is a demo database, so not everything is populated with terribly meaningful data. But as you can see, it's brought back quite a few options in this parsable XML-like format, this JSON format. It's a little different than XML, but it's basically the concept's the same. And it's very easy to take a parser and break this apart and search for what you're interested in. Now, we can narrow this down by putting in an ID. Let's see, let's pick one here. 1477, let's try that. Let's not go with all hosts. Let's go with one host. So we've looked through all hosts and we've decided that we're interested in 1477. IDs required. Put 1477 in there. We'll hit try it. There's our URL that was developed, and this is our response. Now, again, I know there's a lot of zeros in there, and it's all really populated as a name, but in a real database, this would return all the appropriate data. The response code, 200, that means it's good. And the response header is basically what the server's opinion was of your request, and was it okay? And this is a great place to learn these guys, as there is a great amount of detail on what kind of attributes you get and what you get back, particularly in the model. Let's take a look at hosts again. We can even drill down on what individual things come back. Like remember I mentioned that sometimes there's a single instance of a parameter, and sometimes there's a list. Somebody raised their hand. Do I have a question? Or is everybody muted, Joy?
Everybody is muting, but I don't see anything in the chat window. Prasanna is raising their hand. You can take yourself off mute and ask your question, or put it in chat if you'd like.
Okay.
Peter's looking for examples of authentication. I'm sorry, examples of authentication parameters to pass.
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, I've done this out of the browser, and the downside of this demonstration, and when it was I worked with Terry to set it up. Can you hear me, Joy?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I thought I said can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Prasanna said she was talking. They were talking, and we couldn't hear them. So.
Oh, I see. Yeah. When I was shown how to walk through all this, where you're using the cached credentials within the browser, there is a REST call where you pass an authentication token and the user to target against the machine. I got asked that this morning and honestly didn't have the answer of what the exact syntax of that was. So that was something I was going to find out, but I didn't have an opportunity to find that out before this next session. But that's something that we'll follow up on and we can send out is an example of how to do authentication when you're outside of a browser environment, because I agree with you. That's pretty important to know if you're going to use this as scripts outside of the browser environment. But right now, it works because it's cached. And I know that's not...
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I had a couple of questions, right? Now the question is these REST calls, can they be embedded into PowerShell or Perl or any programming languages for that matter?
You know, I'm actually going to mention a couple of examples in a minute, but to quickly answer your question, it is largely language agnostic. So yes, in fact, I'll even give you some pointers to some places where you can find PowerShell wrappers for the APIs and things of that nature. Our guys, when they use this, tend to gravitate towards Python as the language, but you could use shell scripts and tools like curl to send these responses out. So you are not limited. I don't want to give the impression that you're limited to doing this in the browser or something like that. JavaScript's also an option as well. Once again, it's very open and agnostic. So the answer to your question is yes, and I'll go into a little more detail on that in a minute.
Okay.
In fact,
and other question was, we have to authenticate ourselves, right? When we write these REST calls. Mm-hmm. Should we use some local account or should we use admin account? To the server.
Yeah, that is also a good question. You can use multiple accounts. You would probably use the account of whatever user you wanted, because as you know, different users have different permissions, and that applies to the REST API as well. If you use an admin account, you're going to have much broader reach, but you may not want that. If you were writing a simple application that queried for some information that was specific to a certain user's level of access, you would use that account. Generally, using admin accounts is not a good idea for a lot of reasons. So you could create a specific user with a specific set of limitations and or permissions on it and use that. But to the point of one of the people sent in chat, it's kind of like Unix, right? Sure, if you put in root, it always works. But that's typically a really bad idea. So generally, I would say define which count you want. And it is integrated with LDAP. So if you want to use a central repository for managing the credentials, you can do that as well. Okay. Examples. This goes to your question. This is one example. NetApp actually wrote a set of routines that connect to the collect-D daemon. If you're familiar with that, it's a cross-platform tool for getting metrics out of operating systems. So it will go to Windows and or Unix and pull back swapping and network utilization and things of that nature. And it takes it, and the Python routines parse that data and you can use it to punch that information into OCI. So that's an example, and you can go to GitHub and get that. And didn't mean to do that. You can get that code, and you can dissect it and look at it and figure out how it works. So that's a valuable thing. We have a ServiceNow connector for OCI that actually our group here has been doing that will be released shortly. It's still in final testing. And it is a series of Python routines that interconnect ServiceNow and OCI and do things like allow URLs in ServiceNow to bounce back to OCI and show you the assets that they refer to. And again, that's open. That's the source code's open to that, so you can take that apart. And last but not least, you asked about PowerShell. There is a set of PowerShell commands that are wrapped around the REST API, and that's the reference to it on GitHub. So if you're a Windows guy and you want to use PowerShell, that's a great place to start. That's one of several. That's just an example. All right. So the next topic is REST API. That's great. That's a terrific way to go. That's the recommended way to go. That's probably the going to be the most well supported moving forward. But there are other ways to get stuff in and out of OCI. And this is the JDBC, ODBC option, or essentially direct database access. The JDBC and ODBC are essentially device drivers that connect to databases. They have some limited amount of intelligence, but they certainly can't do things like joins and the like. They're generally used to smooth out the differences in access methods on databases. And this allows you to write programs and use tools that directly interact with the database. Now, some of example of these things are I listed below. Things like MySQL Workbench. we're based on MySQL, both the data warehouse and the OCI central server. It also uses a database known as Elastic, but for the most part, it's straight MySQL, and you can access this in many different ways. So this is an example, again, ServiceNow, of how to input the information to make an ODBC and JDBC connection back to the system and automatically be able to pull data and that sort of thing. Pretty straightforward. We just have to tell it what our host is, what we want the table that we pull over to be referred to in ServiceNow. That's pretty straightforward. They call that import sets, and tell it to use a middle. ServiceNow has a middleware engine that accepts these requests on behalf of ServiceNow, and it does the, if you will, the translation between the two. Give it the name of our server on OCI and the required credentials. Now, there's a set of credentials that are built in to the system that allow you to access the database, and these go in at install time. Typically, you're going to use DWH, and these are read-only, so that you're not allowed to go in and mess up some of the stuff. Now, you can change these and make them read-write, but my understanding is the DWH user will allow read access to most objects. I think it has write access to several, but not complete. We don't give out essentially the SQL root password because, unfortunately, if we were to do that, people could go in and do things like change schemas and delete views and other things of that nature. It would make supporting the product extremely difficult to do. So you can use the DWH user. His default password is, oh shoot, it escapes me now. Default password is Sandscreen. Comes back from the Anero days. And that will allow you access to most you want. And so it's pretty straightforward to set this up. Let me use, I hid this slide. Let's normally I would get Terry Pass to show us how that is live, but let's take a look at it here. I think we'll just this is not the one I wanted. There it is. We'll just let it go through. Okay, this is from the ServiceNow point of view. So this is not if you're an OCI guy and you're going, what the heck is this? This is ServiceNow. We go in and we can define various data sources that ServiceNow can use to populate its database from the outside. And here we're picking an OCI data warehouse host. That if we choose that, which has already been set up, it's got the user ID and the password and the server name, etc. put in. There's a source table on the OCI side. There's a target table, the CMDB, that references the ServiceNow database. You take that, run that import process, and we get 166 inserts, or essentially we've pulled over a full table. We can run a transform on that in the ServiceNow environment and say, hey, I want to select a map. And a map is, if you've done this in Excel, you know what this is. When you import something, you say, this field maps to this field maps to this field. And then you can run a transform on that and bring it in. And if we now go look at the ServiceNow instance, we can see that there is a bunch of host information. All of that was pulled by OCI and is now part of the configuration management database of ServiceNow. And it's really pretty simple to do this kind of thing with direct database access. So that's kind of why we wanted to show that quick demonstration of that. And it's recorded because I don't have access to a ServiceNow instance at this point. But it's a very nice way to take the myriad of data that you have in the OCI world and be able to put it back into another system such as ServiceNow. So, all right, get down from here. So, some examples. Well, that was one, ServiceNow. Cognos itself, with the data warehouse, actually goes in and uses these same access mechanisms. So there's nothing magical about that. There is samples in what is known as the reporting guide for OCI. This is a great little resource that is in the NetApp doc store. It gives raw SQL queries examples that you can go to the MySQL command line or any other number of tools and put that query directly in and get a textual result back. And that's very useful if you want to build command line scripts or something like that. But some examples of that are in that documentation on the reporting guide for the data warehouse. There's a few dozen of them out there. You can copy and paste them, or at the very least you can see the constructs that are required. Now, I got ahead of myself again. Sorry about that. I wanted to show one last thing, which is optional tools, just to give you an example of outside world access to the OCI data. Clear this screen off. Now, this is a pretty common tool in the MySQL world. It's known as HeidiSQL, and we're going to use it to connect to the data warehouse and just get a quick look at it and then be able to explore the data warehouse and where it is. So as you can see, I have defined as a MySQL connection. That's the IP address. Data warehouse, that's the password scan screen. Port 3306 is the normal port to connect to. And we can see that we now have sort of an explorer view. HeidiSQL, by the way, is a free tool if you want to use it to look around. But we can now look at various pieces, and we can get the full schema out of how that table is laid out, and use that to construct SQL queries to bring back exactly what we want. But is this an index? How big is it, et cetera? We can even look at the entire populated table of data. So using one of these tools, you can kind of explore the database itself and use that to figure out how you're going to access things. Now, that being said, let's go back here to continue anyways. The data warehouse, because as I just mentioned, you're going to have to, if you want to construct direct queries and things of that nature, you're going to have to understand how those tables are laid out. You can use HeidiSQL to go explore it, but that's not going to tell you the actual relationships between the various objects. And once again, that documentation, in this particular case, I am now looking at the data warehouse, is in the help section. It says schema help. And if we select that, we can see the schemas see the schema tables, and we can pull this stuff up, and it'll give a description of what it is. But as important as that is, we also want, let's see, go back. Come on. No, that's OCI again. Ah, there we go. We can also look at the entity relationship diagrams. All of those are listed out. This is where you can see the relationship between a table. The table may have a pointer to another table, which has a list of objects associated with that one object. The combination of having the schema and the entity relationship diagrams is what allows you to assemble a SQL query, a meaningful SQL query, to get what you want directly out of the database. I discovered kind of an interesting thing when I was poking around with this, in that you can connect into the OCI. This is the data warehouse, right? You can connect into the OCI servers database as well. Technically, this is unsupported, but you can browse around and see what's in there real time. I would not recommend you use that as a data source because we don't publish it and we don't document the inside of the OCI server. We do for the data warehouse. But just as a kind of a random technical comment, you can do that if you want. But please try and avoid doing that. It's not a supported practice and will probably get you in trouble in the long run. Okay. So I said our own IBM Cognos uses this method to get in and out. Sample reporting guide I already mentioned. People use this in different ways. Things like Tableau. I've seen that folks that maybe weren't particularly thrilled with Cognos have managed to use visualization tools like that to get in there and use this as a method. There's a company called Avnet that makes what they refer to as Data Pump, which is used to support interaction between BMC Atrium. It's a commercial product, but I just wanted to give you some examples of different folks who use this as an actual means of getting something done. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol. Been around forever. It's been supported in OCI for several releases now as a notification mechanism. In other words, when you had a notification for, whatever violations or something like that, you could send an SNMP trap out that notified whatever your target was that this event had occurred. So that's been there for a while. And that's actually pretty useful if you've got some other tool like, Nagios or something of that nature that you want to put together a centralized monitoring console. And maybe you just use Nagios in the past and you have OCI as well. You can have it pick up on the traps and that's just a particular example. However, what we have recently added, touchy keys, SNMP has been added as a means to collect data in OCI. We didn't really have any way to do this easily in the past, and this allows the integration of generic data, if you will, into the OCI universe. So if your device has what they refer to as an SNMP agent on it, and they have a MIBs available for it, MIBs are management information blocks, and they define what objects on the particular device are exposed and where they are in the hierarchy of information that agent exposes. You can take this and build what we call a management pack or an integration pack. It's a very well-defined set of information, which I'll show out in a minute. And it defines how that information surfaces in OCI, what its attributes look like, and that kind of thing. My only comment about SNMP is that it can be very resource-consuming. I believe we limit our number of collectible items for one object. I think it's currently set at 25. And SNMP polling can take a long time. If you try to ask for too many objects, particularly ones that have arrays of return values, it can take seconds to do this and it will time out. So use it sparingly and just get what you want. This is an example of how you build one of these custom integrations. We've built a number of these already for you to just download and use, but it consists of two parts. I mentioned you have to have the MIBs. If you look over on the right of the screen, you essentially build a file tree with the MIBs in it. And then at the top of that is what's referred to as integration.json. And that's what you see on the left. And that's the JSON file which sort of defines the mappings between what you want the attributes and objects in OCI to be versus what they are in the MIB. That's your ETL translation, for lack of a better term. And if you build this correctly, and I find it a tad bit complex. I would love to see like a tool that put one of these things together that allowed you to do the mapping. Maybe one of our guys will get gung-ho and program something like that. But if you build these packs, then you now have the ability to use SNMP data, and this is a great way to integrate stuff because it's so ubiquitous. So it's an excellent example. Next option, Syslog. Syslog's been in OCI for a while, and again, is a notification type. If you go into the notifications and configure this, you can then use that mechanism to send out things like SAN path violations, performance alerts, and the like. And why would you want to do this? Well, a lot of people use centralized Syslog collectors as compared to OCI's granularity, a rather crude event management system, but it's pretty common, and it's nice to be able to plug OCI into it. So Syslog provides a great way to do that, without a whole lot of effort. And last but not least, there's SMTP, or AKA mail to everybody else out there. Don't overlook this. It's a seemingly simple component, but it's a great way to introduce OCI events and things like that into ticketing systems like ServiceNow. And in my former life, I used the queues in Salesforce to accept these things and assign tasks to people. It's pretty simple to do. You just have to set up the target mail server. We have to have an SMTP relayer or mail server, and then you just give it the person that you want it to go to. There's a signature file in it that, in addition to the information OCI puts in the payload, you can just add flat text to it. And this is a great way, if you're going to build a parser for this information, to know that it came from OCI and which particular OCI server and the like. So the signature is more than just to say this was sent to you by your friendly OCI system. If you decide to do SMTP integration, you know that you can use it to put some keywords and things to do routing. To give you an example, creative use of this, I was working with one of the customers around here, and they were talking about how they had built a granular report management system. And the whole point of it was to use SharePoint. Now, if you're familiar with SharePoint, it's Microsoft's document information management system. And you can have folders that go down to a very granular level, to a single user, to groups, it's really quite sophisticated. What you can do is you can get Cognos, the report generator, to schedule reports and email them. SharePoint has a SMTP ingestion component. So you send it off to SharePoint. SharePoint can look at the message, take the message, and file it under any number of places. And what you have now is somebody then goes into SharePoint to see the reports. They say generate them every night. And you can have a great deal of control over who can see what. We can do some of this in OCI, but we don't have the granularity of going down to saying only X person can see a certain dashboard. And this gave the people who were building this a great degree of control over who could see what reports, and it was all done automatically. And they didn't actually have to have an OCI account. They could just go out to the SharePoint site and see their stuff generated. Now, you can't do that with real time, but you can do that with, say, a 24-hour lag via Cognos reports. So that's just sort of a creative way of doing integration with SMTP as well. And that's what I got. The takeaways from this is you can enrich your other environments, like your ITSM, your management systems, by auto-creating tickets for ServiceNow, for Salesforce, based on OCI information. You can populate CMDBs to the outside world, and vice versa. So there's multiple interfaces to do this. The REST API is the real programmer's interface, but don't forget about the alternative means such as Syslog and Mail. And keep in mind, if you stick to the formalized interfaces, in even the database as well, the closer you stick to not drawing from outside data sources that we may not have control over, the easier it's going to be to do this. So that's what we have for today. Any questions?
While people are typing up their questions in the chat window, I just wanted to thank you, Charles, for a wonderful session. We've all learned a lot, and I will remind everyone else that this session is going to be recorded, or was recorded, so I will send that out probably tomorrow morning once I review it and get the deck and everything all together. So your feedback is always welcome. Thank you very much. I see a couple of thank yous coming through the chat window.
I appreciate that.
Any further questions?
Yeah, I had a question, sorry. So let's say we want to ingest external data, right, into OCI.
Yes.
Let's say there are some commands. Say, for example, take a Vmax array, right? Vmax frame. We might want to run some commands which are not supported by OCI, and we want to ingest the data into OCI database. Is that done through REST? I mean, how do we do that?
Well, it could be done through a number of means. REST would probably be the most likely place to put it. The only problem with that is that you have a fixed schema, right? In that the REST API calls have defined fields of which you can populate and the like. If you were using a REST API call for a Vmax filer, for instance, and trying to add something that wasn't there, that's not necessarily an ideal way to do it. I would think that you would actually be probably better off using the SNMP interface, because you can then define actual new fields and populate them with that extra data. But you know what? I'm not the end-all be-all guy on data sources. That would be Matt Ostaguy, and he could probably articulate that better. But it's certainly a way of getting data in and out. I don't know that it's going to be usable if you actually had to extend the number of fields that were available on that object. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm talking about extending the number of objects.
Right. I think that and again, there are people smarter than I are on this. I would probably think that would be an SNMP task, simply because you can define the objects in that particular case. And it's the only place that I'm aware of that you can actually, you're not really extending the database schema itself, but you are adding objects to it. So I think you'd probably have to go that route.
The SNMP route, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a lot of use cases coming up like that. Okay, I have to think about that.
Yeah. Well, feel free to pose us some questions, because if you want to email me, I'm charles.fox@netapp.com, and want us to dig into that a little more. That's a very reasonable question, and I've given you a relatively vague answer. So if you'd like something better, articulate what you want, and I can run it by the reporting guys and some of the infrastructure people and get their thoughts on it, because this is me brainstorming and not necessarily the only way to do it.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Thank you. Charles.fox@netapp.com, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, we are thinking of a lot of different options. All right. Let me compile some use cases. Maybe send you an email, Charles, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. I'll talk it over with some of the team and see if we have thoughts or point you to some supporting documentation that would help you resolve those. I'd be happy to do that for you.
Okay, great.
All right. Okay. Going once, going twice. 9 minutes left. That's not bad. Give you 9 minutes of your day back. It's certainly better than this morning when I was at home and we had a freak snowstorm here in Denver, and it created all kinds of havoc with DSLs. So I would drop out every 30, 40 seconds. It drove everybody crazy. And I'm glad that I drove into town to the NetApp offices to do this one here, so that hopefully your experience was a lot more enjoyable than the first time around. But we appreciate you coming, and hopefully you learned something, and look forward to more of these sessions in the coming months.
Thank you very much, Charles.
All right.